just so that you're familiar with this room, if you want to speak, you can press this glowing red button in front of you. This is actually a hidden microphone. So when it pops up and turns green, we can capture your voice. So if you're whispering with someone, please make sure that this is off, right? Red means off, green means it's live. So this morning we do have people joining us on Zoom. So when you speak, when you have questions, it's good to use the mic so that they could hear you. And I'm still seeing a very intact back row. Could I invite you to come forward? Okay, thank you. Yeah, when I was a student, I used to be doing that as well. I'm one of the back rows. It's like that actually is my favorite position in the room. The most strategic one. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. My name is Winston. I lead the admissions team here at Asia School of Business. Yeah. We're glad to have you here on a Saturday morning, joining us for this this masterclass. And this is a hybrid format. So let me welcome those who are joining us on Zoom. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are from around the world. So this morning, just some very basic ground rules for those who are on Zoom, right? Let's keep this professional. Let's keep this courteous. If you have any impolite comments, we may flag that out. And if you're being disruptive, we may be forced to remove you from the chat room, just so you know. And secondly, we also encourage those who join us on Zoom to turn on your camera so that we can feel that you're participating with the rest of us here in the room. Along the way, if you have questions for those who are joining us on Zoom, please use the raise hand function so that we know that you have a question, and we'll pay attention and we'll signal to the speaker that you have a question to ask. Right. It's not working. Okay. Pardon me while we try to sort out some technical issues. For those who are not familiar with Asia School of Business, we are a very, very special school founded in 2015 between the partnership of Bank Negara, the central bank of Malaysia, as well as MIT Sloan School of Management. Okay. Why MIT? Why Sloan? Why does the central bank want to set up a business school? Right. Thank you. Okay. We will get to that, but first let's look at the agenda item today. Now we're in the room, and I will get to introduce the school to you, and then at around about 10 o'clock, we'll move on to Professor Shadul, who has graced this occasion and giving a masterclass, right? And thereafter, some sponsors message. I would introduce our MBA program as well as executive MBA program to you, and we break for lunch. Unfortunately, for those who are joining us on Zoom, we are not live streaming the lunch session, so I guess we shall look forward to the day when you join us on campus, and we'll be more than happy to host you. And for those who are joining us in person after the lunch, we'll arrange for you to have a campus tour so that you can look. This is an opportunity for you to get to know the facilities that we have around the school, as well as Instagram moments that you can post on your social media. So welcome to ASB again, right? This is a school, as I mentioned, that we have set up in collaboration with MIT Sloan School of Management. So, as I mentioned, we were founded in 2015. Now, the central bank want to start a school, and it wants to start a school to nurture future leaders, right? Future business leaders that understand what ethical leadership it means. They want leaders that will go on to make impact positive impact, right? Not the kind that sends you to jail. Positive impact in the developing world. And of course, who better than MIT Sloan School of Management? Because MIT stands for a bunch of people who are interested to make positive impact on the world. So Bank Negara did not approach some other business schools. That stands for Wall Street greed. So it's very important for you to know that our mission statement, we want to become a premier school of management, right, here in Asia. We want to be the place where people will come here and engage with the growing Asia. And not just Asia, but also the heart of Asia, which is ASEAN. And we want to develop transformative and principled leaders, people who will go on then to pay it forward by making positive impact on society and the developing nation, developing world at large. So of course, you know, we have to talk about our leadership. Our Dean Sanjay Sama himself, professor of MIT, before he joined us here as dean, he was actually the vice president at MIT. He was the vice president of open learning. For those of you who have taken classes on MIT X, you have taken, you know, classes on Coursera, he is actually one of the prime movers between these movements because he believes in education access, right? He believes in the democratization, which is a very mouthful word, of higher education. So he's making big changes here at ASB. There will be more exciting changes in time to come that we'll progressively announce about. In the local word, you know, we call it akan datang, right? So, yeah, Professor Sama, he joins us, but he's not just your typical academic, right? He himself is a very, very successful entrepreneur. From his lab in MIT, they spun off this Oak Systems, right? Oat Systems, pardon me. And Oat Systems is behind the invention of the RFID technology. For those of you who are not familiar with RFID, every time you go through a toll gate and some money gets deducted, you have Professor Sama to blame. But that is an example of how, you know, in the MIT ecosystem, knowledge and commercialization happens. And this is the same type of DNA that we want to nurture here at ASB. And today, you know, we have the pleasure of having Professor Shadul here with us. Before he joined ASB, Professor Shadul has spent already a long time here in Malaysia. Right? Before ASB, he was at MISI, right? And he is really the leading expert on supply chain and logistics related subject matters here. And we're very glad to have him. Just a list of accolades, right? Professor Shadul has his PhD in engineering from MIT. He is also the associate professor and director at the MIT Scale Networks Malaysia Institute, which is MISI. Yep. And of course, for those of you who are interested to learn more about Professor Shadul's thoughts and writing, you can always get a book and get his autograph. But I speak too much, right? Let me turn the floor over to Professor Shadul, and then we'll come back to talk more about our MBA program. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much, Winston. And oh, you don't want to go through these slides yet, huh? Sorry, I'm revealing the secret. Okay, good morning, and thank you for joining us in person as well as on Zoom. So Winston, thank you very much for the introduction. And if I may add what Winston said about Asia School of Business, we are really a unique school. Many of us are not just academics, but we also do a lot of work in practice. Either in our previous jobs, we have worked in the industry. So I spent a few years in the industry before I came for my PhD. And or we are currently engaged in some kind of applied work, either in NGOs, in industry, consulting, and so on. So a lot of our research, as well as teaching in this classroom and on this floor, is informed by not just what's in the books, but what we know by working in the real world. Okay, so, and many of us have that kind of pedigree. And I think that also makes ASB unique, in addition to our focus on action learning, which I believe Winston will talk about after my talk. So what I want to talk about today is the topic of sustainability, but from the point of view of the challenges of actually pursuing the goals of sustainability, and how do we tackle those challenges. At any time, if you have any questions or comments, you want to share your perspective, I'm happy to hear that. So both those of you who are on Zoom, as well as obviously in the classroom, just raise your hand, I'll call on you. If you're on Zoom as well, please raise your hand and just interrupt me if there's someone on the Zoom, please, who wants to chime in. Okay, so I would like to make this interactive as opposed to speaking for 90 minutes because I don't want to make you bored by the end of this 11:30, by the time we reach 11:30. Okay, so what's the context? Well, we don't really need to set the context, but let me share a few pictures with you. A couple of years ago, there were devastating floods in Malaysia, and that wasn't the only time, right? We have had floods since then, but in 2021, 2022, the floods that we had, the most number of people were displaced by those floods in the history, since we started keeping track of these natural disasters. The year before that, just around COVID, there were deadly wild bushfires in Australia. These were the deadliest in the history, the recorded history of Australia. It burned 18 million hectares of land. And just as a point of reference, peninsular Malaysia is about 13 million hectares. So imagine all of peninsular Malaysia burning down, plus some more. And that was 2019, 2020. About the same year, the year before, a couple of years ago, India and Pakistan had a massive heat wave. This was the hottest March in the Indian subcontinent in a very long time. Temperatures of 45 degrees, nearly 50 degrees Celsius were recorded, and that was in 2022. And there I can keep giving examples, more and more and more examples of events like this, but what is common among all three pictures that you see on the screen is the way they were described. They were once in a century disasters, but they now happen every year. So we are living in a world where these once in a century disasters are happening every year. They're happening all the time. So I hope there are no climate deniers or climate change deniers in this room or on Zoom. But if you are, this is a time for us to open our eyes. The world is warming up. The climate is getting extreme. And we are going to pay a price of that. And these are not just anecdotal evidence of 3 or 4 case studies that we have picked up. If you look at kind of a longer term data, more data that has been collected for a long time over the whole globe at many points of reference, if you look at the surface temperatures, you can see that they have been steadily increasing. So the world is getting hotter and hotter. It's going to have ripple effects and so on and so forth. So we're living in a world where climate change is an urgency that we need to respond to. And I believe by now most of the sane people believe that yes, that is true. Okay, we need to do something about it. If you look at, so where does it come from? So it comes from greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so the greenhouse gases, like there are several of them. The most popular that we know about is CO2, carbon dioxide, right? It is not the most damaging one, but is the most voluminous one. It's the one that we emit the most. And so these greenhouse gases, they get trapped in the atmosphere. As a result of that, sun rays cannot escape back, and it keeps heating the earth. So if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, where they come from, this is a very nice chart that was put together by World Resources Institute. If you go on the website, this is an interactive chart. Pretty cool. So you can click on each segment and see the details of that. What are the origins? What are the what those gases result into? Pretty informative. But if you kind of look on the right side of the screen, with my back facing it, you can see lots of the yellow and the orange. This is all energy. And about 3/4, about 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from various energy sources. And then we can see what they lead to, right? So for example, they'll lead to, they come from residential buildings, mining and quarrying operations, just from road transportation. In agriculture, there are greenhouse gas emissions that I'll talk about shortly, from livestock and manure, and so on and so forth. Okay, so it shows which industries contribute to these various emissions. And then there's other part of this chart that shows what exactly those greenhouse gases are. So the biggest one is CO2. It's about 73%. CH4, anybody remembers their chemistry? Methane, right? Yeah, 18%, right? So that's the impact. And so this is actually not the volume, but it's measured in terms of impact. And you may have seen this. So the impact of these greenhouse gases is translated into something called greenhouse gas or global warming potential, GWP. It says that if that gas were to be trapped in the environment for 100 years, how much heating will it cause? And to cause the same amount of heating, how many equivalent volumes of volume of CO2 or weight of CO2 will we have to emit? Okay, so for example, for every kilogram of methane emitted, it's equivalent of emitting 28 times as much CO2. There are some, it says F gases. These are fluorocarbons, like CFCs and so on. There are various of them. And their greenhouse warming potential is in thousands, tens of thousands and so on. So the volume might be really, really small, but you multiply by their GWP magnitude and it has a bigger impact. Okay, so the big impact ones are obviously carbon dioxide, methane. These are the two big ones, and NO2, nitrous oxide, N2O, sorry. So the question is, what can we do about it, right? How can we minimize these emissions to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and reduce the global warming? And there are various initiatives in place. So first of all, if you look at what these gases, how they have been emitted over time, we can see that there is a sustained increasing trend. So this data is from 1990 until the year before COVID. And there has been steady increase in all these various GHG gases. It has been declining. So in the first decade of this millennium, the GHG emissions increased by about 2%. In the second decade, which ended with the COVID, it increased at 1.3%. So the increase has slowed down, which is a good news. But it needs to slow down a lot more. Okay, so we are on the right track, but we need to keep doing what we are doing and do a lot more. Okay, so we need to slow it down. Okay, so what we do for mitigating these impacts. Mitigating means how can we minimize the emissions of GHG so the bad things that GHG causes are reduced. That's the mitigation. That's one of the two major strategies for dealing with climate change. The second is called adaptation, which I'll talk about later. So we have things like wind turbines, wind energy, solar energy, and there are a lot of investments being made in that, right? And that's a good thing. There are also initiatives like electric cars. So it is not enough to have just an electric car. If our electricity comes from burning coal, it's useless. It's not that useful, right? So we need to make sure that our electricity is generated without emitting as much GHG. And then we want to use that electricity for clean electricity per se, for driving our cars instead of using diesel or petrol and so on. Right? So that's kind of the second part. And then the third thing is things like composting. So when I teach this in my class, I would take a poll and ask, how many of you compost at home? That's great. Hey, can you turn the microphone on, please? Also, say your name, and
Hi,
then.
My name is Hao, but I believe composting sort of produces methane as well.
Okay, so then why do you compost?
Food waste, mostly food waste.
Okay, so so the chemistry of composting is that if the food waste, right, if you throw that in the garbage, it will end up in a landfill. And in a landfill, there is not enough oxygen to interact with that food. So instead of producing CO2, right, it will produce methane, which we saw is 28 times more harmful than CO2. In composting, it will decompose the food at a slow rate. So whenever you compost, do you always churn the food, right? Why is that? So the air mixes with it. Your wife does that. See, you don't know very completely. You just stay away. It smells, right? Yeah. But the reason you churn that is because to mix it with air. So you'll have more oxygen come in contact with food, and you make CO2, as opposed to methane, which is a lot more harmful than CO2. That's why we all should be composting. And the second benefit is that the output of composting is extremely nutritious for plants. In fact, we compost at our home, and there are different composting systems. You can use bokashi system, which comes from Japan. There are different other composting ways. And then we use that output for the plants in our house. And the fruits and the veggies that we get, like herbs and so on, you can notice the difference. So if you don't compost, I encourage you to do it. It's not just good for the environment, but also good for yourself. Okay, so composting is for that CH4 part, which also has a big impact, methane part. And then there are initiatives like recycling and so on, so we are not throwing as much stuff away in the landfills and things like that. So we are doing things, but it's not enough. Any guess on, so we have a plastic bottle, right? And many of us use plastic bottles. And they all are recyclable, right? What percentage of them get recycled? Any guess? Yes? You seem like you are jumping to give an answer. So my rule of thumb is anytime somebody makes their eye contact with me, I call on that person to ask a question. Okay. 20%? Okay, that's we have one person saying 20%. What do you think? Is it more or lower than that? Lower. Lower. Oh my goodness. Okay. What is it then? 17. Okay, we are coming down. Okay. Okay, turn the microphone on, please, so our Zoom friends can hear.
Okay, sure. I'm Priyanka. I think that it would be even lower than 1%. I don't think we're recycling plastic that much, and it really depends. Are we talking about global recycling levels, or are we talking about Malaysia itself? I think that we've made a lot of strides since 2019 to be recycling and being more sustainable with our material uses, but we're very behind. And I believe it was 2019 that there was so much information in the news that we were running out of landfill space in Malaysia. So I don't actually think we're recycling that much, but I could be wrong. I don't know current data of this year or last year's.
Okay, so Priyanka has a very good point, right? So this will vary by where you are, right? Malaysia, let's say I do some teaching in India, recycling rates are quite low. Some other countries, say maybe European countries, rates are higher, right? So it will vary by the country. Yes. Also, can you say your name first before you make your comments?
My name is Anand.
Anand, okay.
Okay, maybe if you look onto the industry, they are the big players. They are taking seriously now in terms of waste management. Therefore, the recycling on the plastic basis, I think 20% very reasonable.
Okay.
What do you think about that?
Okay, so let's see, anybody on Zoom wants to give their statistic? Maybe you had a chance to Google. Recycling rates globally, yeah. So the average is about 9%, 9 or 10%. Okay, so it is still very, very low. I mean, ideally we want it 70. Ideally is 100%, but at least should be in 80, 90%. That's why we all buy these plastic bottles and cans saying that, of course, I'm going to recycle this. But guess what? It ends up in a landfill. 9 out of 10 times, the bottle is going to end up in a landfill. Yeah. So there's a lot more needs to be done. Yeah. So Priyanka, you are absolutely right. The rates are very, very low, and obviously they vary by the country. 9% is global. Yeah, that's kind of the data that we have. Okay, so now, and Malaysia is a country of oil and gas, and some of my friends tend to be oil and gas people, and over dinner parties, we often have conversations about oil and gas. So I hear interesting things. Well, let's just say what you guys think. So is renewable energy really cost competitive with fossil energy? If not, how far is it from being competitive? 50%, 100%, 200%? What's your guess? Yes, Priyanka.
I have a question. When you say cost competitive, do you mean cost to the manufacturing firm or cost in total for the whole value?
Cost for the user. So if I say that instead of buying a, say, petrol car, I'm going to buy an electric car, right? So total lifetime cost, right, including the initial cost and so on. Is it cheaper to drive a petrol car or an electric car?
It's definitely cheaper to drive a petrol car in Malaysia. We have only started putting charging ports across the country in the last Q4 with Gintari pushing it with BMW and Mercedes-Benz. However, besides just the charging ports, the cost of recharging the car is also a problem because it hasn't reached economies of scale. And then we have the other issue of cost of purchase for the user, right? So Merck and BMW and GYD, they're getting into these loan structures, but when you compare it to owning a petrol car, I could be wrong because I never was interested in buying an electric car. I think it would cost you maybe 150% more at this current situation, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
I think I think you are definitely wrong because I just returned my BMW iX40 to my company.
Yeah.
Now I'm buying a smaller one, a much smaller one. But if we're talking about the cost of running an electric car, okay, in the 12 months that I owned the car, zero servicing. That means I went to the service center 0 times. Okay, there's a time saved there, money saved there. And because I recharged the car at home using my solar panels, it cost me 0 cents.
But Shihao, I want to challenge that view. I agree that cost of maintenance is just not there for you. And you bought a GYD, right?
No. My company gave me the iX40.
So what brand is that?
The BMW.
A BMW. Okay. So first point that I want to ask you is that your total cost of purchase? Just maintenance is not your only cost. You have the car.
Okay. We just look at the basic one. Okay. The BYD Dolphin. It's about slightly over 100K. And I don't know. The data that the reports that I got from China is just that let's say over 7 years, the cost of owning the BYD Dolphin to a comparable petrol car, I think it's about 20% lower.
Okay, that's
But
great.
that's
So
one thing.
yeah, okay. No, you know what? So this is fantastic. Okay, so I'm gonna now just in case now everybody wants to go home today, right after lunch,
fine.
right? So only because of that only reason I'm going to cut this conversation off. But I want to say something like this. So I'll point something out here. This is what you're going to experience in an ASB classroom. You're going to have people who come from diverse backgrounds, very knowledgeable people, and they are going to exchange their ideas, they're going to exchange their expertise. And the role for an instructor like me is not only to teach you what I know, but also to facilitate that conversation. So if I was in a classroom, I would not cut this off. In fact, I would get engaged. I see that Anant, right? Anant had his hands was inching towards the microphone, then it couldn't stop and finally turned it on. But so I'm going to ask you to just quickly share your comment. But that's exactly what you'll see in an ASB classroom. And yeah, and there is, we'll come to Zoom in a minute. Yeah, but that's the richness, okay? And that's why you not only do you learn from the instructors, but also you learn from each other. So Anant, and then I'll come to Zoom. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's around 20 to 20 average, 20 to 50% of cost competitiveness that you can save.
So 20% higher?
20 to 50 roughly.
20 to 50% higher, okay? So first of all, it also depends on where we are, right? Because in Malaysia, petrol is subsidized, right? So it's going to be cheaper compared to electricity, right? But it depends. Now, if you go to America, you might see, for example, at a junction, there are 4 petrol stations on a corner, and each of them has a different price. There are apps in America that show you in your neighborhood who is selling the cheapest petrol. In Malaysia, we don't need that because the price is same throughout the country, right? So it depends. And the prices can change every week and so on. Yeah. All right, so Zoom. Let's see. Firstly, we need to reduce our unnecessary single-use consumption. Can you scroll up? Who is that? So Reshmi, I completely agree with you. Yeah, recycling is the last resort. Due to logistics accessibility, I have to send my recyclables to recycling centers. So Reshmi, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So my wife does that as well. So we collect all our recycling, cans, aluminum cans, glass bottles, paper, plastic bottles, and I believe we bring them to One Utama, which is where we have a recycling center. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. If we don't make it convenient, not many people are going to recycle. Yeah. Okay, so thank you for these comments. Keep them coming, and if by the end of by 11:30, if I am done with just 10 slides, but if we had great conversation, that's a successful class for me. So what I'm going to show you is cost comparison of various renewable energies. Now, this is again a global average. Okay, so what you can see is, and this was published by IPCC in 2022. Every single, or no, most of the dominant renewable energy sources are cost comparative. So this gray area is the fossil fuel cost in year 2020. Okay, it's an average, right? And it's a range. I believe this is a 5 to 95% confidence range. And same thing with all these ranges. So this is photovoltaics, right? Is a lot more cost comparative. Wind, offshore, onshore wind, offshore wind, solar panels, and so on. And you can see that renewable energy is actually quite cost competitive. Unless, no, in Malaysia we have subsidies because we don't have an EV network or that is developed very well for cars. And we don't want the cost of living to go up. So it's a phased approach, right? Which is what we are doing in the country. But if we take the subsidies away, this picture will look different in Malaysia as well. Yeah, so you can find this report, IPCC's 2022 report, very detailed, lots of statistics, information not just from one country, but all various parts of the world, Asia, Africa, Europe, North America, so on. Very detailed reports. So good news is that yes, renewable energy is cost competitive. But now we have to make the transition. We are in a fossil fuel-based system, and we have to make a transition. Even though renewable energy is cheaper, making the transition is not costless. It can be quite expensive. So let's talk about what that means. So when we talk about sustainability, there is a need for investing in the infrastructure. What do I mean by that? Let's just take the example of wind turbines. So a wind turbine has lots of parts, about 8,000 parts. In a, not the one that we have on the houses, that's a simple one, but a utility grade wind turbine. A wind turbine that a company like, for example, Tanaga National, TNB, or a utility company would want to invest in. About 8,000 parts. Producing the blades themselves can take about up to 2 days, 1 to 2 days. So it requires some technical expertise, it requires some investment in the manufacturing infrastructure, but not just the company that is making the blades. You are going to need a supply ecosystem who are going to make the parts, and you're going to need the suppliers who will make the components to make these parts, and so on, right? So there's a need for a manufacturing base to just manufacture these different parts and blades and towers. Then you need to ship them, right? So these towers can be pretty tall, 300 feet. The blades themselves can be about 300 feet tall. This is large stuff, right? We need to make sure that once you manufacture them, you can actually ship them on the roads, that the bridges are high enough that it can go under. We need cranes to install them, right? So now we start kind of peeling the layer of sustainability and saying, what is it require? What do we need to make this transition happen? Once it is done, once it is installed, then we need to connect it to the grid. So that's some additional cost. We know how to do it, but also you need investment in battery, because the way at which electricity is produced by wind energy depends on the wind. There's no wind, there's no electricity. Same with solar energy. We can't produce solar energy at night. So the time when we produce it and when we use it, the demand and supply may not balance. So we need an intermediate storage when the demand and supply are not balanced, and that storage happens to be batteries. So we need battery banks to store the energy in, right? So we need that, we need periodic maintenance and so on. And then there is the soft talent required, not just for running these facilities, but also the engineering behind it, the science behind it. So if we want to now even just buy wind turbines or solar panels from somewhere, right? We need to just handle the logistics. But if you want to make them ourselves, there's a manufacturing and talent ecosystem that we need to create. And that is what I call is the supply chain infrastructure. We need to create this. Now, whenever we want to create infrastructure, there are challenges. Infrastructures live for a long time, and I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by that by giving an example of a real project that I worked on that has been implemented about freight transportation infrastructure. So just in a few slides, I'll come to that. But just keep that in mind that for infrastructure investment, first of all, there's a lot of uncertainty about how the thing is going to be used, wind turbines, roads, things like that, over its life, which might be 10 years, 20, 30 years, and it's hard to foresee what that period is going to look like, what our demands are going to be. And then often it requires coordination among multiple stakeholders, okay? Which is not easy. So just to give you an example of uncertainty, there was something called rare earth crisis about 12 years ago, 14 years ago. Does anybody remember that? Priyanka, yes, what do you remember about it? You are in metals, okay. Do you want to talk about it briefly? Turn your microphone on if you want to.
Miners were not extracting at the rates that we needed for creating infrastructure, whether it was our current construction infrastructure or the clean energy products. Now, can you define what you define as rare earth minerals? What do you define them as?
So I'm not a chemist, okay? So if I start talking about chemistry.
I'm not a chemist either, but I just want to know because I will come from a copper perspective.
So copper is not a rare earth.
Yeah. So.
But if you look at this picture of periodic table that I strategically put in case there was a very brilliant student in the classroom who was going to ask me a question that I may not know the answer for. So rare earths are kind of this part of the periodic table that is highlighted in on the screen, and they are critical in clean energy. So for example, we're taking the example of wind turbines, right? To generate electricity, we need magnets. We need, for wind turbines, have permanent magnets. To make the permanent magnet, it's an alloy of iron, obviously, and it has some rare earths in it. So to make the transition to green energy, if you are going to install wind turbines, we need to extract these rare metals from the Mother Earth. Now, the reason they are called rare is not because they are rare in the Earth's mantle, okay, so in our minds. The reason they are called rare is because their mining activity is extremely polluting. So most countries don't allow it. So as a result of that, their supply is rare. No, distribution is not rare, their supply is rare. And in 2010, so there was a rare earth crisis, and I'll tell you why those crisis was in a minute. And at the same time, people were realizing that the rare earths are really critical for this green energy transition. So Department of Energy in the United States kind of published this white paper that describes what is the supply risk of these various rare earths. And if you want to know so there are terbium, okay, let's see, neodymium, right? So there's a car company called Neo, right? This is where the name, this is the one that inspires that name. Okay, so how important they are for clean energy and their supply risk. Okay, so we can see how critical these rare earths are. And the reason there was a crisis is because at that time, at least, there was no alternative. So if you want green energy, if you want these permanent magnets, you must have these rare earths. About 95% of the supply at that time came from China in 2010. And in July of 2010, China said, we are going to cut down the exports of rare earths significantly by 3/4, by 72%. And there was a panic. They said, wow, we are completely dependent on the supply from China. And the government, Chinese government has said, they're going to cut down the exports. What do we do? So anytime there is a problem, what do companies do? Yes, and they sue, right? You take the kind of people who are doing the things that you don't like, you take them to the court, which is what happened. Countries took China to World Trade Organization, sued them in WTO, and said, you can't do that. 95% of the supply comes from your country. You can't just cut it down like that. But at the same time, some other things happen. So companies like Linus, Molycorp, they have mines in Australia, in California, and so on. They opened their mines. They said, no, this is a great business opportunity. We had shut down our mines because the environmental cost of running the mining operation was very high. Wasn't feasible for us because there was so much supply coming from China, which was cheaper. So they reopened the mines that they had shut down. Companies stockpiled. Remember what happened early days in COVID? Everybody was buying masks, gloves, toilet paper, right? We stockpiled when there's a crisis. Companies did the same thing. They started stockpiling these rare earths. Prices went up. But at the same time, companies also started to do innovation. See, can we find alternatives? Because the stockpiling is not a long-term solution. What else can we do? And then China quotas were unfair, WTO said, and China said, okay, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, so went back. Okay, so about within 2 years, a year and a half, the quotas were lifted, and we are back to normal. So what happened in that period when China announced export controls until when WTO said, you can't do that, and they said, okay, sure, let's open the tap fully again. So companies like Molycorp, they said, okay, this is a great opportunity, and market got really, really excited. So look at the stock price of Molycorp. It went down from about $15, $16 to about $75 right after this crisis. Right, went up massively. Once China said, when WTO said these are not legal, right? You must abolish these export controls. Here's what happened. Now, opening a mine is not same as opening a tap of water in our house, right? So it's a capital-intensive activity. So now, when we are talking about sustainability and we are talking about infrastructure investment, starting new mines, opening a closed mine, right? These are long-term decisions. And we have to somehow factor in the uncertainty that the environment that we are in today, the business environment, may not remain the same 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. Things might change drastically. So the decisions that I'm making today, are they still playable? Are they still smart decisions in that future? That's the question we need to ask. Right, so that's what happened with Molycorp's price. Came down to cents. Same with Linus, right? So they both had the same fate. Prices went up and then crashed once the quotas were abolished. So that's the example of uncertainty. And this uncertainty is present in all kinds of things. So let me give you one more example of global climate change adaptation for companies. What are the uncertainties in that? So in Malaysia, we are a country that is dependent on exports of natural gas, which is Malaysia is a big exporter, as well as oil, right? And there are some massive assets that we have invested in. We cannot turn them off overnight. There has to be a gradual transition. Anytime there is a gradual transition, we have to think about what the future will look like. What would 2025 look like? What would the regulations be? What would alternate technologies look like? What would people want? Right? Would there be trade barriers, and would it be feasible to get some stuff in from China versus other parts of the world? So lots of uncertainties, right? That needs to be thought about when we're talking about things like offshore wells, FPSOs, and so on. Even when we are talking about, say, green energy. So this is a chart from, I think this is from, International Atomic Energy Agency. So what this shows is the projection of wind patterns in the world. So we are saying the world is getting hotter. Sorry, you didn't fall asleep, right? Okay, I just want to make sure that you just didn't take a down. No, okay. For me, that's the most important thing, to make sure that nobody's falling asleep. Okay. So the wind pattern is going to change as the surface heats more, right? So what this chart shows is that in the change from 2016 to 2035, how the wind pattern is going to change. So in some parts of the world, the wind speeds will slow down. Other parts of the world, the wind speeds are going to increase compared to the 2016 baseline for this chart. So we're in Malaysia here, right? We're in this kind of blue zone. So we might see some decrease in wind speeds. Now, so if you are a company, as a company making an investment in these wind turbines, we have to factor that in and say, okay, so how would that affect the energy production? And now thinking about lots of other uncertainties, price of energy and so on, how much would that actually cost? Yeah. Now, some things are uncertain, like things like this. What would the regulation be? We don't know. What would the relationships between different major economies in the world will look like? Will they still be fighting, or will they get along? We don't know. So there are some uncertainties. Other things such as this, which we fairly know well, because they change very slowly, I'll call it trends. And we know how things are going to change, but we know what they will look like in the next 20, 30 years. So we need to have some way of factoring in these uncertainties, real uncertainties, as well as trends that are predictable. And that's what brings us to this key challenge of sustainability, which is decision making under uncertainty. So if you were to go to a business school, you might start a class from this slide, decision making under uncertainty. What we have done in last 35 minutes or 40 minutes is we have talked about what does that uncertainty look like, what does decision making look like. So that's what we are talking about. Making long-term investment decisions is difficult because we don't know the future environment, what that will look like, in which these decisions are going to play out. Okay, so this is the area that I do research on. I've been working on this area since 2007.
Can I stop you?
Yes, please, yes.
Morning, man.
Okay, so Alan, can you hold, please? Let's go to our Vignesh. Why don't you go ahead, please, Vignesh. Unmute yourself and share your thoughts. Was it Vignesh?
ஒன்னு 30 தானங்க.
Okay, Vignesh, can you unmute yourself? Mute yourself, please. We don't want to know what you're going to order from Grab Food, okay? Is there any way we can him? Thank you. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just wonder just now because we still not answer the question of the cost comparative
Yes.
between renewable energy transition to fuel. Compare.
Mm-hmm.
What is the percentage then?
So I showed you the statistic, right? These are global statistic. Exactly what the percentage is in Malaysia, I don't know.
Globally?
Okay, so we'll have to go back to the slide, but if you look at, say, photovoltaics, solar energy, right? It looks like it's about in that, so there was a band, right? So in that band, yeah, right?
But not
So
percentage.
yeah, it was around like a, say, about 25 percentile mark. Yeah. So in about 25% of the countries, fossil energy is still cheaper. Actually, it goes up to 95. So 70% of the countries, solar energy is cheaper. So it's in that band. Okay. So if we need specifics, we'll have to do the calculations for Malaysia to see now what is the cost of our current energy base, right, in Malaysia for different sources and so on. But the key thing to keep in mind is a lot of people believe that green energy is not cost competitive. That is wrong. It is very much cost competitive. The exact numbers depend on which part of the world we are in, and we'll have to do the calculation.
Sorry, sir. I noticed that universities never do case studies in terms of commercial values on this, rather than more technical.
Yes.
Or,
Yes.
yeah. This is what I noticed. Even the transition for net zero, if a country is embarking on that,
Absolutely.
or industry is embarking on that, what will be the cost?
Absolutely. Yeah.
on the
Yeah. We can
transition?
find that information.
Yeah. Even though Singapore never did that. Sorry,
I don't know. I mean, if we can look for this information, and there's a lot of data. So what I have shared with you is just a tiny scratch of the surface, right, from IPCC. So this is like IPCC is the global data, but we can go to, say, Malaysia, we can go to Singapore, go to China, right? China is now really doing at the leading edge of the innovation in green energy, right? So we can get data from these different countries. There's a lot of data available out there. Okay, so what is the challenge? So the challenge is not just long-term decision making under uncertainty. The challenge is making these long-term decisions when we are narrowly focused on the problems of today. And I work in supply chain management. If you ask any supply chain manager, take their 1 week, ask them what did they work on for that 1 week, you will find that nearly 100% of the time was spent on issues of today, maybe next week. It's all about what's happening right now. Everybody's super busy working on operational issues. I have done research, I've done work with executives in senior supply chain executives, and they struggled. There was a project I did with executives at a pharmaceutical distributor. This was back in the US when I was still doing my PhD. This was a multi-billion-dollar company, and we worked with about 24 senior supply chain executives in this company. And this is when the healthcare sector was going through a lot of transition. There were regulatory changes. You may have heard about Obamacare, right? So this is when President Barack Obama said every American must have health insurance, and that would increase the amount of medical health system users by about 15–16%. A lot more increase in volumes to be carried. But the medicines themselves were changing from kind of branded drugs to more generic drugs, which have about 80% lower profit margin. So you sell them on cost as opposed to service availability. New kinds of drugs were emerging, biologic drugs, which need, like vaccines, which need cold chain transportation. So you need to invest in that cold chain distribution. Trucks that can carry the goods, warehouses that can store these goods between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius, right? That's the cold chain, right? And that infrastructure needs to be built. So there are lots of these changes. And I interviewed all these executives, 2 dozen executives, about what should the company do. So I asked them 2 simple questions. What do you think the future environment is going to look like for this particular sector over the next 5 to 10 years? And what should your company do to prepare for that? Every single person struggled. And these are vice presidents, some senior vice presidents, directors of the company. They struggle not because they are not smart. These are some very, very, very smart people. They struggle because our mind is focused on day-to-day issues. We think our future is going to be looking like today. So, for example, when we make a plan for today, let's say we are planning for tomorrow. Let's say you're a retail store and you want to make an estimate for how many people would I expect to see in the store tomorrow. Well, we can take what we know today, project it forward, and we know that forecast is going to be pretty accurate. Tomorrow is going to look very similar to today. Okay, so Suresh, just hold your thought for a minute and I'll come to you. Yeah? What about a month from now? If I need to make a forecast a month from now? Well, we can still make it based on what we know today. Give some margin of error, plus minus 5%, it will still be accurate. Yeah? So for short term, we have really good tools. We have forecasting techniques, which are getting more and more advanced based on machine learning and hybrid forecasting techniques and so on, which are really good at predicting short-term future. Fantastic techniques. When you're making an infrastructure investment, you're not thinking about tomorrow or next month from now. You're thinking about several months in some industries like electronics and so on, which have very fast clock speed, to years to decades. Can we do the same thing? Can we take what we know today, just extrapolate it forward and say 5 years from now, the world is going to be pretty similar, just our volumes are going to increase. Can we do that? We cannot, right? And I could give you, give lots of examples of that doesn't work. But at the same time, we need to make that forecast. We need to know what next 10 years are going to look like if I'm going to invest in something that's going to last for 10, 15, 20 years. So how do we make this decision? So that we will discuss next weekend, right? No. So let's take a pause. Let's go to Suresh. Okay, Suresh, what's your question? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, greetings, Prof. Thanks for the lecture. I hope you can hear me well. Actually,
Yes.
I just got a question on the back of my head. I mean, as more and more organizations or businesses embrace in the sustainable and green journey, what I notice is that the capital expenditure for these green techs are rather costly, and then to a certain extent hindering organizations to embark on this green technologies and initiatives. So how do we manage that cost or on the business side of things for organizations to move faster in this sustainable green journey? Especially, and I did some analysis before. I mean, part of my work, I noticed that the payback period in investments for these certain green techs can range up to like 10 to 15 years before it's actually you get a return on investment from embracing this kind of green technologies. So any thoughts and comments or reflections regarding this?
Okay, Suresh, that's a very good question, and that is the question, that is the critical question we are discussing, right? So let me first of all share my views about quantitative analysis. Now, let me give you I'm an engineer. All my education has been engineering. I breathe numbers, okay? I strongly believe in quantitative analysis. When I started working on my dissertation, my PhD on this particular topic of kind of long-term decision making in supply chain, things like infrastructure investments and so on, let's say, characterize that problem, challenge, as what is known in mathematics as stochastic decision making, which is basically decision making under uncertainty. And there's a lot of math models for that. It can be pretty analytical. Pretty soon I realized that it doesn't work. The reason being, we just don't have, our mathematical tools today are just not good enough to accurately predict long-term future, which is what we need. We need a picture of the future that can say, okay, if I'm making an investment 5 years from now, this is what the world is going to look like. Think about 2030 in your own mind. What do you think 2030 is going to look like? Can I just take the trends that I have seen in the last 3 years, maybe 2 years, take out the COVID exception, and just continue plotting that trend into the future? Will that be what 2030 look like? So when we are doing quantitative analysis, which is what I strongly believe in, which is what we need to justify our decisions, we don't have a good basis for making those forecasts. So that's why a different technique is used, and I'll tell you what that technique looks like, but also it has its own limitations, and then we can think about, no, what can we actually do with that? Okay? So we cannot forecast future in terms of numbers very well. So what is done for domains like this is, instead of taking what we know today and projecting it forward as forecasting trends, seasonality patterns, and so on, we instead create, sorry about that. We instead create different scenarios of the future. This method is called scenario planning. So instead of saying, here is what I know, here is what I have seen, let me extrapolate that into the future. Instead of doing that, we start in the future and say, you know what, the world might look like this scenario, or it might look like scenario number 2, or might look like scenario number 3 or 4, and work backwards from that scenario and say, if my future, as in this picture that you see, was the red scenario, what kinds of investment should I make? If the future that I live in is the green scenario, what investment should I make? And then use that to guide our decision making. Okay, now obviously many of you are probably thinking, but how do we come up with the scenarios? Right? There's a systematic way for that I'll talk about. But before, just hold that doubt for a minute. It's good to have that doubt. Okay, that's a critical question. How do we come up with these scenarios that we plan to use for making multi-million and billion-dollar investment decisions? To justify these decisions, how do we do that? Before we talk about that, let me tell you a little bit about scenario planning. So it's a way for not just planning, but preparing for what might happen and monitoring the changes in the environment and see which scenario are we heading towards. Are we heading towards the red world, or green world, or blue world, or yellow world, and so on. It's a way of preparation and learning. It's not planning. Planning works for short term, for this week, next month, this quarter, maximum 1 year, right? We make budgets for a year. Planning works for that. That's about the limit. Anything beyond that, right? Planning has some limitations. We need to think about other approaches. So this method actually came to the fore in 1950s. So 1950s, this is when the Second World War had ended. there was a change in the world order, right? There was the kind of Western countries, the US and the European allies had won the World War. There was a lot of destruction worldwide, right? The Soviet Union was emerging as another power. So people realized that the world that we are heading into after the war is different from the world that we have lived in until then. And to plan for that world, to make investments in national defense infrastructure is where people started thinking about scenarios. So it came from the defense sector. Then in 1960s, France used scenario planning for its national planning. So for the 5-year plan, just like we make in Malaysia, right? France used it for its scenario planning for its 4th national plan. But the most popular use of scenario planning comes from Shell. So any of you work in oil and gas industry? Yeah, some of you, right? Would you mind, does your company use scenario planning? Okay, can you turn your microphone on, please? Thank you.
Sorry, I used to work in an oil and gas company, so we work in power utilities serving Shell, Petronas. We do scenario planning like once every 2 years.
Yeah.
Because we have a regional office in it needs approval, so it takes a longer forecast than usual. So I think it depends on the situation that we are in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So Shell is the first company that is widely acknowledged as the first kind of big corporation to use scenario planning for their strategic long-range planning. They started doing that in 1967, and they said until then they are making their budgets and 5-year plans and so on, right? Now, pretty standard approach that we learn in business schools, right? Not ASV. Yes, we learn that here, but we learn also other things. And in 1973, there was a war in the Middle East, which is exactly 50th anniversary of that is what we are experiencing now, unfortunately. But after that war, the price of oil quadrupled in a matter of weeks. It went up from $2 a barrel to $8 in a few weeks, quadrupled. We have never seen a price increase like that. Shell was the only company when that price increased in 1973. Shell was the only oil major to deal with that kind of sudden shift in the business environment, price of oil quadrupling. And that's when it came to realize, how was Shell prepared for this? And that's when people started learning that Shell was doing something called scenario planning, and they had been thinking of a scenario like this. So when I read that, the engineer in me realized that I could never forecast a war using my mathematical forecasting techniques, right? We do need to have some way of envisioning these scenarios, what might happen, and to prepare for that like Shell was doing. And for a long time, Shell was the biggest company in the world, right, in terms of revenue. So that became known, and by 1980, about 40% of Fortune 500 or maybe Fortune 1000 companies reported using scenario planning, about 40%. That percentage varied based on the sector. So if you went to asset-heavy industries like oil and gas, chemicals, much higher use of scenario planning compared to kind of asset-light industries. And since then, scenario planning has been in vogue. Yeah, the biggest example in supply chain domain is UPS. In 1997, UPS started using scenario planning, and their most famous case is this is when .com was getting more and more popular, right? Many of you in this room probably know when the .com was rising, and then there was a crash in 2001, .com burst, the bubble burst. So UPS had a distribution network which was basically a hub and spoke network. So it had big sorting facilities, right, that are used for sorting boxes, industrial facilities located outside major cities. And what UPS would do is that they would have these trucks, brown trucks, that's the UPS color, go throughout the city, collect their packages, bring the stuff back to the sorting facility, get sorted overnight, bring it to an airport, and it takes to, now planes fly overnight, go to a destination, stuff is unloaded, sorted, and then it goes to the again to the recipient. UPS realized that in e-commerce era, that's not going to work. It's not just businesses sending mail, like sign letters, right? This is before PDF. You could sign things on PDF. You need a different distribution network. You need a distribution network where consumer can walk into a shop, say I have to send this gift to my friend or girlfriend or whoever, and just, do you have packaging paper? Yeah, can I package it here, right? So I need packaging facilities, a nice facility that has provides good customer service as opposed to an industrial center. So UPS bought a company called Mailboxes, etc., which had that kind of distribution network. They had 3,500 stores in the US with that particular footprint, and another 1,000 stores in different parts of the world outside the US. We have Mailboxes, etc., in Malaysia. If you go to Gardens Mall, there is a, I think it is UPS Center, but it still has the sign that says Mailboxes, etc. in Gardens Mall. I think it's at the below the LG level. This is the part between Mid Valley and Gardens, so it is still there. So there are these are stores are worldwide. So UPS bought that company based purely on thinking about a scenario that the future might be quite different from the world that they are working in. UPS bought that company for $190 million. As soon as UPS did that, their closest competitor, FedEx, realized, oh shit, if we don't do this, we are going to be out of business. So they bought a company that had 1/3 as many stores for $1.2 billion. Because that company realized, oh wow, my stores are way more valuable than Mailboxes, etc., what they sold for, because this company is desperate. So that is given as a very famous example in supply chain domain of how scenario planning is used. And the method is used widely. So probably the government that is best in the world for using scenario planning is Singapore. Singapore does all their national planning using scenario planning, all of it. They have a group that reports to the Prime Minister's office called Risk Assessment and Horizon Scanning Group that does scenario planning for all kinds of activities. You're expanding the port, your land development authority, right? Everything is done using scenario planning. In fact, I've been to some of their meetings. Singapore probably has the most sophisticated scenario planning techniques in the world. They are very, very advanced, and they use it everywhere. And there are lots of other companies, as you can see on the screen. So scenario planning is a technique to use for making decisions for planning for the future that we cannot forecast very well, which is what we have in the case of this sustainability for the green transition. Okay, you may have heard this term scenario planning during COVID. Lots of companies were publishing the scenarios of how we are going to come out of COVID, how long this thing might last, what should we do. Almost every single consulting company had developed scenarios. If they did not develop scenario, they are probably not in business. Okay? Almost every consulting company did this. So that brings us to questions about scenario planning, such as how do we actually create these fictional scenarios, stories of fictional futures, future that has not happened obviously, future that's going to look very different from today. How do we come up with those stories to make investments in multi-million, billion-dollar assets? Can we just make decisions based on just stories? How do we know once let's say we say, yeah, we are going to do that, the board approves it. How do we know which scenario we are heading towards? How do we track what's going on now and know what is the future heading, which future are we heading towards? And is there any evidence that this actually works? Making decisions based on scenarios. Do we know? Yes, we have anecdotal evidence. Shell did something, it worked. Does that mean it works for every single company? Maybe they just lucked out. How do we actually know that it works? And if you look at scenario planning literature, the claims are that it changes the way people think. It changes minds. Is there any evidence of that? And the short answer is yes. That has been my research for the last almost 20 years now, 15 plus years. The short answer is yes. There is evidence. We have done experiments ourselves, and if you are interested, we'll talk about it afterwards, because I don't want to talk about research right now. But there is plenty of evidence. We wrote this book 2 years ago. We kind of answer these questions based on 3 cases that we worked with actual companies. And these 3 cases where we looked at kind of 3 unique flavors of supply chains. We looked at a global beverage producer. In that company, supply chain was a function. It's the logistics function. The company made beverages. The goal of supply chain people was to distribute them in different parts of the world to different types of customers. The second company we looked at was a pharma distributor. For a distributor, supply chain is the business. There is no business strategy to report to. That's their business, to distribute. Buy medicines from one side, distribute them to tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of clinics, hospitals, pharmacies, and so on. And third we looked at was a project called Future Freight Flows. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it because this is public. This was a very large project at MIT, and I happened to be at MIT at that time working on my PhD, and so I worked on this project as part of my dissertation. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But basically this project was a kind of a federal level agency wanted to create a framework that any planning agency in the United States could use to make their infrastructure investments in the freight infrastructure. Okay? So all kinds of shipment infrastructure. So it could be any state department of transportation, could be any metropolitan planning organization, right? So for example, New York City will have its own freight transportation plan for the city and the areas around it. Different cities will have that. Ports would use this facility and so on. Okay, so it's one framework that anyone can use. So part of that, we developed 4 scenarios and a process for using them. And we actually demonstrated this process and the scenarios in 6 different workshops around the country. If you are interested, now you can type Future Freight Flows, you can get the report, it's all public information. So what does that mean? So let me give you some examples of what I mean by freight infrastructure investments. So we did one workshop in the state of Washington, which is in the northwest corner of the country, okay, as you see here on the screen. Next, it has a border with Canada. The top, this part is Canada. So they were thinking about questions like, should we invest in one highway, a major highway that's called I-5, Interstate 5, that runs north and south. So it will connect to the state of Oregon, which is at the south of Washington, D.C., run all the way through California and could be coming to Mexico and then going into Canada. So should we invest in that highway? Well, that's kind of one project, right? One idea. That means expanding the capacity of that highway, adding more lanes to it, or putting more money in maintaining that, or creating some kind of electronic toll infrastructure and so on. Okay? Should we put our money in it? Or should we put our money in a highway that goes east-west? So it will start from, say, Port of Seattle, cut all the way across the state, go through Idaho, and then it can go, this I-90 actually goes all the way to Boston, which is right here. So north, south, east, west, 2 roads, but very different use. If you are living in a world where if you're living in a world where lots of goods are imported from China, and if you need to bring them into the country, you need this east-west infrastructure. If there's a trade war between US and China, as it is going now, happening now, and that flow shrinks, and you start producing more locally in Canada and Mexico, you need kind of north-south infrastructure. Right? This is just one state, but you have similar issues in every part of this country. And the same logic kind of applies in different parts of the world? Or should you have build not just focus on building major highways, but arteries, kind of connecting roads, roads that connect big highways to population centers, big highways to production centers. There are some roads called farm to market highways, right? Should we invest in that? Or should we just not invest in any of that, but invest in rail because it is greener than truck transportation? Or invest in riverways and waterways, or invest in pipelines, which is another mode of transportation that we don't think of, right? So there are about 16 projects like this. Okay, so I'm just giving you some examples. And the goal was that whatever you invest in today, there are kind of 3 planning horizons. There's a short-term plan that these Department of Transportation have, which is about fixing potholes. And so there's a accident and then guardrail has been broken. So very short-term planning. Then there is a medium-term plan. Next 3 to 5 years, what do we need to do? We need to add 1 lane because of the highway is getting congested and so on. And there's a long-term plan which can go from 10 to 30 years. So we're working on the 10 to 30 years part. Okay, so the scenarios describe the world in year 2040. And I'm going to share one scenario with you just to give you a flavor of what it looks like. And then we use these scenarios, there are 4 of them, to think about which investments should we make. Okay, so I'll tell more about that in a minute, but let me talk about, so now this is what we're thinking about, how do we plan for next 30 years. Yeah. So what was done was that when you're thinking about decisions like this, you cannot just say, okay, you guys in the planning team get together over coffee and decide what we should do. It doesn't work like that. You need to bring in the stakeholders. So we had these different workshops. Each workshop had about 50 to 60 stakeholder groups that came to the workshop. You had people from, let's say, shippers. So these are the manufacturers, retailers, companies that ship stuff. So we invited their directors of supply chain and so on to this workshop and said, look, we are thinking about making long-term plans. We want to know what the freight infrastructure in the state of Washington is going to look like, what the freight environment is going to look like. What do you think are the demands going to be and so on. We invited carriers. Carriers are the companies that carry goods, trucking companies, railroad operators, companies that run barges through rivers, airport operators and so on. We had planners of different local level, federal levels, state level. We had environmental groups. There is a fairly large Aboriginal Native American population in the state of Washington, kind of like Orangasli people, right? So we had representatives from those. So all these people came together because we wanted to get a diverse perspective on them. And they talked about, okay, in each scenario, what investment should be made and so on. Okay, so there's a very rich data set here. The basis of that is the scenarios. So the question was to come up with scenarios of, this was done in 2010, the world 30 years out, 2040, that will be, those scenarios will be appropriate for designing freight infrastructure of any state in the country. So what are the key uncertainties here? Right, so again, there's a lot of research went behind this. There were a couple of workshops that happened at MIT. We did a bunch of interviews. Extensive research went into this. And from that, what we realized is that there are some major uncertainties. One is resource availability. And we could be living in a world where there are adequate resources of all kinds, energy, minerals, talent, all kinds of resources. Or there could be a scarcity of that. We could see both possibilities. And the second major uncertainty was trade. What would the trade environment look like? Will it be global or would it be regional and local? So in 2010, our first scenario described a global world where you can get resources from anywhere you want. In 2010, almost everybody believed in this world. This is a global world. Globalization is here to stay. That's the world we are going to be living in. That was the default mindset at that time. Is that the world that we are living in now? Absolutely not. right? So if we had just believed in our mindset and said, that's the world, global marketplace we are living in, we could have just made forecasts and projections based on numbers and said 2040, these are the numbers, use them to do your calculations. But if we said no, the world could be quite different. So there could be a world which could be highly local or regional. There could be scarcity of resources. There could be fights among nations. They'll try to protect the resources that they had. People did not believe in this world when we were doing these workshops. We had a kind of a systematic approach for running scenario planning. And we told people that you kind of have to keep your beliefs aside. We took literally 2 hours to take everybody through each scenario to show them how it is possible and so on. This is a lot of convincing work. That's the world in 2023, looks a lot like it now. So this is when NAFTA-STIC is called, because NAFTA was a treaty that facilitated free trade between US, Canada, and Mexico. So we call it NAFTA, NAFTA-STIC, fantastic. And it described a world that is broken into regional blocks. There's a North American block. There is a China and Africa block. There's a Europe block. There is a Southeast Asia block. We thought, okay, world would not, this scenario is a blocked world. And there's scarce resources, but within the block, you can trade resources very freely. Across blocks, it's highly controlled. There are trade barriers and so on. Very much like what we see today. That was described in 2010. And we had another world called One World Order, global trade, but scarce resources. Somehow the world comes together to live in peace, realizes that this is an existential threat, global warming, to humanity. And we as a world must act as one entity, right? So this was the scenario. We are nowhere close to it, but there was one scenario. And last scenario we described was what we call millions of markets, in which we said that the world could be local, but because of technological advances, there could be enough done locally. So things like 3D printing, you can produce locally. Small-scale nuclear reactors, I'll say that with a caveat. Small-scale nuclear reactors, which is possible. You can produce electricity locally. Now you can do that with solar panels on your house or wind turbines on your house, right? We talked about nuclear reactors. This was 2010 until Fukushima disaster happened. And then we said, no, there could be other things. Natural gas became abundant because of fracking. And we said, okay, now that can be used for kind of local production. Okay, so 4 very different worlds. And for each world, we had a brochure that about like 12 to 15 pages long that described what the world looks like for each scenario. It gave statistics about what the future would look like and so on. So story, numbers, and we created videos. Because different people need different kinds of information to be convinced. Some people want to see numbers. Otherwise, they don't believe in anything else. Some people don't want numbers. They want to see big picture. They want to read stories. They want to see videos. So you need to create information that appeals to all kinds of thinking. So let me just play one video of this millions of market world, because it's kind of cool. And just a 6-minute video, and then we will come back to this.
I decided to quit Intel. Then my peer managers asked me, oh, so which company are you going? I said, no, I'm not going anywhere. I'll become a full-time trader. What's the question? Are you sure? Just imagine quitting a job with 20K pay with good benefits. So they said, yeah, I'm very sure. Then, you know the stock market is risky. I said, yeah, I'll be trading options at a time, because that's my, and I've been practicing actively daily for 3 years past to make sure that I'm consistent before I quit. Right? So I said I did my homework, I've done it, I'm consistent, I can quit. So then he was saying, oh, I have friends who have been doing option trading and has been losing money. I think you better.
Over the last few decades, dramatic technological breakthroughs have changed how we work, where we live, what we eat, and how we communicate. Like a number of other nations, the United States has become increasingly self-sufficient. Even individual regions and cities within the country are following this trend. Advances in fabrication and smart materials have transformed the economics of manufacturing. Small batch factories coexist next to the consumer, while the volume of imported goods has dwindled, global trade in intellectual property, services, and some raw materials continues to grow. The rise of safe, small-scale nuclear reactors, along with abundant natural gas reserves, has reduced the need for imported fuels. Virtualization technologies have enabled professionals to work and live anywhere across the U.S. As a result, the country has experienced a greater migration towards more livable and social mid-sized cities. This is the widely fragmented yet highly connected world of millions of markets on November 2nd, 2037.
Welcome to your NetView. Your top recommended item is a video feed. 234 members of your professional network suggested that you watch it ASAP. The video contains information relevant to your meeting tomorrow.
In the last 15 years, we have experienced an unprecedented revolution in technology that has reinvented the way we live, the way we do business. Before the nuclear renaissance, nobody would have believed that America would overcome its coal dependency by embracing small-scale, decentralized nuclear reactors. And who would have thought that after total market virtualization, almost all aspects of commerce would be managed by digital avatars powered with artificial intelligence. Likewise, intelligent fabrication has reshaped the global manufacturing landscape, permitting the emergence of low-cost regional fabrication. Who would have thought this would make the United States almost 100% self-sufficient? At Boise Design, we are proud enablers of local cycle.
Okay, let me just pause there. So you can get a sense that this is describing a very different world from what was in 2010. But you can see some of those things. People migrating towards more livable cities, that happened after COVID, right? United States being completely energy independent, unheard of in 2010 until fracking allowed the country to tap natural gas, and now United States is a net exporter of energy. This was not expected in 2010. So since we're only 10 minutes now, you can watch this video. This is on YouTube. Let me just go back to our presentation to summarize. But what I want to give you a sense of is, okay, just give me a minute. Share this. So when I say scenario, that's what we are talking about. We are talking about a very different future than what we live in today. And that's the method that is used when you have to make decisions for the long term. We continue to do research on this. We have done a lot of work with different companies on this topic. But the single biggest important thing for long-term decision making is not that we have the right data or numbers. It's changing the mindsets of the people. People, managers, senior executives often tend to think we know what the future is going to look like. Okay, there are great examples. I would just, if you get a chance to watch this video of Steve Ballmer, who was Microsoft CEO. He had an interview on CNBC in January, I believe, 2006. This is just after the week prior, Steve Jobs had announced iPhone, the first ever iPhone. And CNBC interviewer asked him, it's an old clip and you can see that. So what do you think about this iPhone that Steve Jobs just announced last week? And Steve Ballmer, iPhone? And he just ridicules it. It's a pretty funny video to watch actually. $500 piece of technology, subsidized technology, who is going to buy that? Okay. So experts. This was Steve Ballmer. He was the CEO of Microsoft, the biggest tech company at that time. Experts can be completely wrong. Oftentimes they have good information, right? So the key thing is that we cannot just say, because boss says so, the future is going to turn out that way. It doesn't work that way. The future doesn't listen to the boss. Boss may not know. But still, we need to make good decisions that are going to last for a long time, right? And that's why Scenario planning is a method that focuses on changing the mindsets of the people. So we have only 8 or 9 minutes left, so I'm not going to go through. No, I had a bunch of slides that talked about how do you create scenarios and so on. I'm not going to go through all those slides. Happy to talk to you about it after this class, outside the classroom. But let me skip ahead and let's see. Let's see why this is important. So we are living in a world where there are lots of critical uncertainties ahead of us. So we are talking about ESG, right? I mean, there's the whole topic of sustainability, about environmental, social governance, kind of the bigger umbrella, right? And there's a greater concern for investing in sustainability. It is absolutely the right concern. There are the COP meetings, COP26, COP27, right? We are coming up with decisions, right? And it seems right now that, yes, we are going to go straight into this world where everybody's going to be greener. But it's important to be mindful of that not everybody thinks the same way. There are some countries, some people, they say, well, we are not going to let this green agenda derail our goal of our economic development, lifting people out of poverty. We are not going to do that. At COP26, Indonesia refused to sign the declaration. They said development is our first goal, sustainability is second. So not everybody is on the same train. Same time, are the consumers willing to pay for green stuff? If you take a survey, ask millennials, would you buy a green product? 80–90% will say yes. Then they'll go on TikTok and go on Shein and buy fast fashion, which is terrible for the environment. So we say one thing and do something else, right? So are consumers willing to pay for these things? We have to think of that. What about technological adoption? There are different technologies in the play. Which one should we adopt? So there are lots of uncertainties even with the sustainability agenda. There are other uncertainties. Digitization, this is a big one, right? We are talking about AI. Since ChatGPT came out in November 2022, everybody is talking about AI. There are Industry 4.0, right? Before ChatGPT came on everybody's agenda, now people were talking about what is your country's Industry 4.0 policy? What is your company's Industry 4.0 policy? Now everybody's talking about what is your company's AI policy, right? New flavor of the month. We have seen greater investments, willingness to invest in technology after COVID, because people realize that we need to invest in tech. But there are downsides. There are cyber attacks. There are threats of your data getting stolen. There is a serious concern about artificial intelligence surpassing human intelligence and being a threat, being an existential threat to humanity. Concerns about privacy, bias and things like that, which can slow down the development and adoption of these technologies. Is this the end of global supply chains? There is a lot of talk about self-sufficiency. We must produce what we need. Well, guess what? Talk about cars. How many countries in the world produce cars? Well, 3 countries in the world produce more than 50% of the cars. China, United States, and Japan. About 23 or 25 countries produce 95% of the car. Is every single country going to build their own car plants? Not anytime soon. Even if they do, the supply chain of automotive supply chain, tier 1 suppliers, it's massive. The top 3 suppliers have revenues about $40, $50, $60 billion. Companies like Bosch and Magna and so on. Massive companies. Their market share is 3%, 4%. This is a massively global industry. In fact, 44% of world's GDP is in imports and exports. Is that going to go away? So we don't know. So there is a force towards self-sufficiency. At the same time, globalization cannot be undone that easily. So what is the future going to look like? We don't know. So there are just some examples that we talk about in our book. But the key thing is that today, if you are making any long-term plans, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, there are lots of uncertainties that we need to be mindful of. What you see on the screen is some of them. So what we need is an approach to factor in this external environment in our long-term planning. And what we have seen is that the world is becoming global, there are long lead times, it's getting faster and faster, so this is becoming even more and more urgent. We live in a world that is very difficult to manage. So scenario planning, which we use, we think is a good way of structuring the uncertainty. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it is a very good approach for thinking about the long term. It's been used for more than 70 years, and what it does is that it captures the underlying driving forces that are shaping a particular industry and uses them to develop scenarios. They are used for supply chain planning for long-term decision making, but also recently they are being used for short-term since COVID. And the key part is that we have to start thinking about organizations as not as static entities, that you build the infrastructure and your job is done. No, we create infrastructure, we adapt it. It's a process of continuously adapting the infrastructure because the business environment is not stable as it was in 1950s and 60s and 70s when a lot of the decision making tools that we use today were developed. We live in a very different dynamic world, and we need tools for this dynamic world. Scenario planning is a way of dealing with that. So what we need is we need to create these infrastructures by building flexibility in them. Okay, what that means now, in my class I say flexibility, don't use that word. It's an F word in my class that people are prohibited from using because it can mean anything. But no, so there's a systematic way to think about flexibility. But what we need is leadership. We need scenario thinking. We need to think about not just this build a system, but how do we adapt and adjust as we go along. Monitoring the environment. We need to create organizations that are sensitive to what's happening around us and bring that information in. And in our research, what we see is that we see scenario planning as a holistic umbrella that allows us to do these things. Companies that we have done work with, they really believe in it. They have the leadership necessary to create this organization to kind of adopt this approach. So it requires some level of maturity as well. Okay, so if you're interested in further reading, there are lots of publications. So I'm just sharing a couple of them here that if you're interested, we can. So first, the paper describes the highway project that we talked about. The middle one is the scenario planning for COVID that we wrote a couple of years ago. Thinking more about vigilance. There's a lot of talk about supply chain visibility. I strongly believe that is necessary, but absolutely not sufficient. We need to go beyond that. So we have papers on that as well. And these are all readable papers, something that will not make sure that you can read past the first page and not fall asleep. If you're interested, you can scan that barcode, QR code. I'll be happy to share that paper with you. So that's it. I'm sorry I'm 18 seconds late. But thank you for your attention, and happy to engage with any questions. Okay, so over to you, Winston.
Right, thank you, Professor Shardul. Do we have any questions from the floor or anyone on Zoom? You could type your question in the chat box, or you could use the raise hand function to ask any questions. Sure, yeah. Okay, okay, yes?
Professor, do you have any model that you Professor, do you have any model that you use in the scenario planning? For example, because the financial viability is one of the big factors to decide which project they should proceed. Do you use a stimulation model? Do you use a cost-benefit analysis? And which is a better model you recommend us to use?
Okay, very good question, right? Because we still need to financially justify our decisions, right? So the approach is to develop in this case we have 4 scenarios, and create the financial model for each one, right? Getting just one financial model itself can be quite time consuming. If you have done budgets and so on, you know a lot of work that goes into making one. Making it for 4 can be quite time consuming. But that's something what we need to do. Companies like Shell, for example, that use scenario planning, they do that. Yeah. So it's a fairly extensive exercise. But yes, you use scenarios to influence the way people are thinking. It's a communication exercise, right, tool through the organization. But then when you need number crunching that needs to be done, you think about what the cost would be in different scenarios and so on.
And we have a question from Vignesh with a raised hand. Vignesh, would you like to come on camera and ask your question, please?
Very good morning to everybody. Thank you so much for the session. I'd like to excuse myself from turning on the camera, please, if that's perfectly all right. So my background is in marine sciences, naturally. So coming back to this question, and Professor, you were a huge proponent of scenario planning and as well as taking Shell in as one of your advocates for this sense, right? Now, when you look at the marine environment on its own, for sure, stochastic models are something that we have heavily used for predictive modelings, whether this has to do with physical oceanography in terms of modeling, sediment models, or even just fisheries, right? So I would just like to talk about in terms of fisheries. Now, I work closely with some of the guys in Max Planck Institutes who are heavy into deep sea microbiomes. Now, Shell, despite understanding fully the repercussions of deep sea mining, continuously to, well, explore these deep sea vents, despite from researchers and professional experts stating the adverse effects of tampering, something that we have little to almost no knowledge about, and Shell is not an organization who are subject experts or domain experts in this sense. Now, without going into this long rant and a tangent about human consumerism and behavior into identifying what is sustainable, because I am a cynic when it comes to maximum sustainability yields and MSC, which is the Marine Stewardship Council, WWF and all this, which I find all these are fallacies, because ultimately there's a lot of money involved, like you said. So how would you justify a company that you're using as a model for scenario planning who continuously, and I would like to use this word in a very conservative, but I apologize in advance if it may hurt people, but continue to rape the deep sea environment that I think we still have little to no knowledge about, and has very deep impact to the environment as we speak. Because if we want to talk about us as occupying an X amount of mass in the world, I believe the ocean constitutes far more.
Okay, so so clearly you are knowledgeable in this field, Vignesh, and you're also passionate about this. Now, scenario planning comes from Shell, and that doesn't, I mean, the business use of scenario planning was pioneered at Shell, which is the method is known for. And regardless of what Shell does in terms of deep sea exploration and so on, it doesn't change that fact. That's number one. Second, regardless of what Shell does in its business, it doesn't make scenario planning any less useful because Shell does deep sea exploration. So yes, they both are connected in the sense that they both are Shell, but they are not, in my opinion, scenario planning is not a result of the deep sea exploration activities. So I wouldn't connect them in the way that you did. At the same time,
completely understand.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a decision-making method that lots of companies use, not just Shell. Shell just pioneered it. I mean, it's a business use. Right? That doesn't mean we throw the baby out with bathwater because we don't like what the company is doing in one sector.
No, I absolutely understand. Perhaps I didn't phrase my question correctly. I wasn't. The question wasn't raised to scrutinize the concept or the utilization of that, say, scenario planning, right? But as advocates, the foresight of such actions, shouldn't that be questioned to begin with, especially for those who are in, say, applied sciences and those who are being proponents of pro-environment behavior, for instance. Consumers in this sense are being questioned whether are they willing to pay the cost of something that's more environment. How many of the floor are willing to be vegetarians, for example, or reduce the consumption of fish? So my question honestly is that for those who are pioneering in this sense, should be better advocates for more pro-environment, or at least be more conscientious in their choices, correct?
Yeah. So
because if I'm going to get...
So,
Yeah.
sorry, finish your thought, please.
No, it's essentially, it's just that, Professor, because again, it is indeed a very sensitive topic, I suppose, and it's a very broad topic, but I just want to pick that if a company is being a proponent and they pioneered something, I believe the onus should be on them to be very conservative and take into account extremely scrutinized scientific input
Okay, so
prior to actually exploration, for example.
Okay, so Vignesh, I hear you. As a person, I think similarly to you. I am a very strong proponent of the environmental issues. I do not like now this rampant consumerism. I carry my own water bottle, my own cup, right? So I actually try to practice as much as I can, try to take public transportation and so on. But that's me as a person. What I'm talking about scenario planning is me as an educator. And not everybody in the world thinks like you and I do. And if you want to make the change happen, we cannot just take this kind of dogmatic mindset and say, no, everybody should think like I do. We have to think about there are different points of view, but we still need to make progress. And scenario planning is a way of bringing these different stakeholders together, think about different ideas, think about different points of view, and make progress towards things that are really important, right? So yes, you and I are in the same camp, but that doesn't mean everybody else is in the same camp. And who knows, we could be wrong, I don't know, right? I don't think we are, but we could be, I don't know, right? So we just have to be mindful that there's a diversity of viewpoints, and to make actual progress, we need to bring that diversity in.
Understand, and thank you, Professor. Correct me if I'm wrong.
So
sorry,
Vignesh, we have another question in the class, so I'm going to ask you to make a quick comment, and then I'll come to the classroom. Okay, so Vignesh, quick comment, and then we'll come to you, Anand.
Sure. Sorry. So can I just want to say, the take-home message is the small little things that eventually adds up to a larger picture. Correct?
Sure. Yeah.
That's
absolutely.
what you said.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you for your comments. Just go ahead. Can you turn your microphone on, please?
There's a point. If you talk about oceanic, then it's mass, which is not considered in ESG.
What are you talking about? If you look at Sustainable Development Goals, marine health is one of them.
Sorry?
If you look at, there are 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Marine health, ocean health is one of those goals. It is definitely, absolutely considered. Yes. Yeah. It is, no, nobody's ignoring. I mean, this sustainability stuff is actually very well thought of. Thousands of people are doing research on it. We haven't missed something big like this. Yeah, go ahead.
It's more because to confirm my understanding from your slides. And what I understood from Vignesh was he brought up moral justice, which is not interrelated to the tool of scenario planning, right? Which your slide showed. So to confirm my understanding, an example of somebody who is actually addressing moral justice that uses scenario planning as a tool is Singapore, for example. I think Vignesh's question was which organizations besides Shell also are successfully doing sustainable activities with scenario planning. I come from metals, so I have the same perspective as you, where capitalism and capitalistic goals are always going to be weighed with sustainability goals. So to say that Shell should be addressing marine goals when it's an oil and gas company, it's going to address it in a long-term perspective. It's not going to immediately address it. But I guess from listening to Vignesh, I guess the question really is which companies are using scenario planning and successfully also being sustainable.
Yeah, so a lot of, Singapore is a very good example, right? NGOs use that. A lot of foundations use scenario planning. So I don't have a ready-made list at my hand, but I know people who have done research. So if you want to look at the research of, there's a researcher, scholar named Professor Paul Schumacher. He was on the faculty of Wharton, is the #1 expert on scenario planning in the world. Okay, he's retired a couple of years ago, Paul Schumacher. he and his colleague, Professor George Day, they have done a lot of work with organizations. They both are Wharton faculty. And one of the studies they did was with foundations. So I think there was about, I don't know, like 130 so foundations in that particular study who did use this method. So we know that it's not just large companies use it. It's companies, nonprofits, foundations, governments, all kinds of companies, organizations use this method. Yeah, but no. And then to the question of like moral justice and value judgment, I'm not an expert on that, but bringing those into decision-making context, right, is not easy. One thing we can do for things like that is to bring multiple stakeholders in at the table, right? Because people have different value systems. They have different expertise. Bring them in together, and then we listen to their views, and we need some way of capturing the diversity of views in our decision-making framework and move forward. And scenario planning is one such framework. Okay, one such framework that I know works very well. There might be others. But again, so think of this value judgment, it's important, but people have different value systems, right? How do we say what I believe in, I don't eat meat? But that doesn't mean everybody else should stop eating meat.
Right. In the interest of time, let us thank Professor Shardul again for his masterclass today. Now, this is an excellent example of how classes are like here at ASB, right? We ask the hard questions, we listen to diverse viewpoints. We may not come to a consensus, but we agree to disagree, especially when it comes to really, really sensitive questions like that, that is very close to all our hearts. Yeah. And also, there are many ways that you can engage with ASB in different manners, right? You could join us in joint research projects. You could engage with us through our short courses run by our executive education colleagues. Of course, for those of you who are interested to pursue a degree in an MBA program or an executive MBA program, then this is what I'm doing now today. It's my job to tell you more about the programs that we run here at ASB. But that said, well, I started today talking about the mission statement here at ASB, which is why we need to put the right tools in the right hands of people with the right mindset. That's the kind of people that we're looking at nurturing here at ASB. Okay, well, this is 2024, but there we go. The slides are on. I'm always say that people say that AI will eat the world, but no, there is always a human factor to it. We still need someone to operate the slides. Put it on full screen. Thank you. Right, as I said, this is my job to introduce the MBA programs that we run here at ASB to you. But for those of you who are joining us online, you may or may not be familiar with Malaysia as a destination. Malaysia is really in the heart of it all. Let me say, where is the part of the world that is growing fastest now? It's in Asia. And which part of Asia is growing fastest? Is ASEAN. Only recently surpassed by Vietnam, but Malaysia was growing at close to 7% last year. Okay, this is a place where you see growth. This is why Tesla has picked Malaysia as a place to set up, right? And Malaysia is a wonderful place where cultures mix, and religions are respected. You can practice the various religions here in Malaysia. It's truly multicultural, multi-religious, and of course, open to multiple viewpoints. And talk about the food. I mean, for those of you who can take a look at me, it is impossible to go on a diet here in Malaysia because of the nature of the fact that Malaysia has welcomed so many people from all different parts of the world. So you can find beautiful cuisines from all parts of the world here. Now, coming back to our MBA program. Our MBA program mirrors very closely to the one that is run at Sloan. And I would like to venture to say that it is even better. Why? Simply for the fact that, number one, here at ASB, you learn from the best of the West and the East. You learn the Western theories and frameworks, but you learn it in the context of growing Asia. And for those of you in the room who operate in Asia, and for those who has experience engaging with Asia, you know that Asia is not homogeneous. Southeast Asia is not homogeneous. You need to have a different strategy in each of the market that you operate in. Secondly, as I mentioned, that you are taught by visiting MIT faculty. You are also taught by our resident faculty whose research is focused on growing Asia. Not to mention the fact that some of these courses that you get to, some of these professors, if you were to be on a Sloan MBA program, you have to go bid for their classes. You may not be able to attend their classes because they do have a long waiting list. But for the fact that we bring them here into Malaysia, you have access to these very, very popular professors. And what really sets us apart from the other MBA programs out there is action learning. Action learning is when we apply what we learn in the classroom out in the field. Our students have the opportunity to go to companies, be up close, right, observing what goes on in a company. And then they have the opportunity to hear from the business leaders, talk to them, and present to them the findings that they have, that they come across when they were observing in these companies. Our students go out, they form consulting teams, solving real-world problems for these companies. And on top of that, when it comes to internship, it is not any other ordinary internship whereby sometimes you get to do random tasks like, oh, please get coffee, or please make photocopies. No, that's not the kind of internship our students go through. They go through a real internship with a real scope, with a project that is deliverable, there is to be delivered within the 6 to 8 weeks that they are serving that internship. And each is carefully picked because it should mirror what they learned in the classroom. So what they learn in the classroom, in theory, culminate towards what they are able to deliver in the field through action learning program. And not to mention the access and the support that we put in for our students. Our MBA program is an exclusive program. We only take in 50 students a year, right? Only 50. And for that 50 students, we have a career development office of 4 officers looking after them. Nowhere else where you hear that kind of ratios, right? 1:1,000 is probably the norm. And apart from that, there is also the extended learning opportunities beyond ASB. For some who wants to go on and learn some more, there are opportunities and pathways, and I'll talk about those in a bit. So let's talk about faculty, right? This is just a representation of some of the faculties that will be teaching on our programs, very respected in academia. Professor Shadul, you had a taste firsthand of his class, right? And for those of you here in Malaysia, you would probably have come across the work that Professor Melati has been. Not only are they academics, they are also thought leaders, and they are also change makers here in the society, right? These are the people that we want to learn from. These are the examples. These are the heroes and heroines that we want to mirror. In our MBA program, it's an accelerated 12-month program because we want you to come in quickly, do your work, have minimum holidays, and then get out into the job market, right? It is going to be stressful. I repeat, it is going to be stressful. And I repeat again, it is going to be stressful. but largely because the program is a simulation of the kind of jobs that the MBA prepares you to go into. If you want to go into consulting, if you want to go into financial institution, if you want to go on to become a leader of a business, be prepared to work hard. But the MBA programs prepares you for that. The MBA programs equips you to be able to work smart as well. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, that this is going to be an intensive 3 semesters, but then you will celebrate it in summer when you go to MIT, when you go to the Boston campus for your summer immersion. You would get to attend classes with the MIT professors in an MIT classroom. You get to do your Instagram check-in, you know, to boast about to your friends, I'm here in this very old tradition, this old-looking classroom that was, you know, that has seen other famous names. The only thing that you will not get, unfortunately, is the notorious Boston snow, right? Because we're going in summer. And for those of you who are interested in an executive MBA program because you want to keep your job and then come into the classroom, we have the part-time executive MBA program. It's 16 months long, right? Slightly longer than the 12-month full-time MBA program. And in that program, you would come into classroom for 1 intensive week of classes, right? Every 5 or 6 weeks or so, right? So do be prepared that you need to devote about 10 to 14 weeks away from work, right? So classes for business practicums and for your summer immersion in MIT. And for both classes, the demographics are slightly, I would say it's interestingly reversed, right? In the full-time MBA program, we are 70% international on average. And in the executive MBA program, of course, given the fact that it will be 70% local, yeah, because it is difficult for internationals to have that level of commitment to travel in so frequently. This is just to give you a quick example of the kind of companies that have hired our MBA graduates. In fact, except for the year 2020, every year without fail, we have successfully placed a student in McKinsey. And for those who know McKinsey, it is a top management consulting, well, among the top 3 management consulting firms in the world, McKinsey, Bain, BCG, right? But they are not just in professional services. Our students also, you know, firstly, they're not just here in Malaysia. Our students are placed in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Dubai, in different parts of the world, right? In Europe, in North America as well. And they're not just in professional services. They join tech companies, they join financial institutions, they join energy companies. And of course, we're hoping that maybe over time, we'll have more people joining the NGOs as well. So what do you get at the end of it all? So upon program graduation, you would receive your ASB MBA program. You receive your Sloan Immersion Program certificate. But given the fact that this program, our programs are in close collaboration with MIT Sloan, so you will be inducted as an affiliate alumni to MIT. You get to use an MIT alumni email address for life. This itself is a brag factor. But you're also invited to alumni events as with any MIT alum, right? You can tap into the MIT network. So that itself is really precious. And earlier on, I talked about the extended learning pathways available, right? So for those who feel that, oh, but I really want to have the full MIT learning experience, right? 3 weeks is not enough. Having the exposure to the professors here in Malaysia is not enough. I want to be on a Boston campus. I want to have the full MIT experience. Yes, you can. So Sloan has this special program called the Master of Science in Management Studies, the MSMS. It is an all-elective program. It is only available to graduates from the 10 different partner schools in the world. Right? We're talking about school like Imperial Business School. We're talking about school like HEC Paris. Talking about school like Tsinghua in China, Fudan. And of course, Asia School of Business. So if you graduate from our MBA program or executive MBA program, you are eligible to apply to this, what I'll call an advanced master's program. It is all elective and it is STEM designated. So which means that you get to pick electives across all of MIT, right? Not just from Sloan. And as well, you get to pick electives coming out from Harvard because of the exchange treaty between the two universities. So this is a great opportunity for someone who says, I want to learn from two of the most famous schools in the US. And the beauty of the MSMS pathway is that it is STEM designated, right? For those who are not familiar with the term, it stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. So STEM designated program, the US government will allow you to have a 3 years work right in the US. So for someone who has this dream of accessing the US job market, this becomes a very viable pathway. And the best part of it all is that, yes, you can go directly to the US and try to access through a STEM master's, but how much would it cost you? Right? An easy estimate, a 2-year master's in the US, given the tuition plus the cost of living, easily sets you back from $200,000 to $250,000 for that 2 years. And then you have that 3 years to try to recoup back your investment. So coming here via ASB cuts that price tag by half easily. And of course, for those of you who say, oh yeah, maybe I don't want the MIT brand name, I want Yale. Yes. Okay, graduates from our program can apply to the Yale Yale Masters of Advanced Management program, right? And they can also apply to the Oxford Said management program as well. So if you don't feel that I don't want a full US experience, I want some British flavor to my education, so that's the other pathway as well. So here comes the money question, elephant in the room. How much does it cost? The full-time MBA program, the tuition is 150,000 ringgit. And for the executive MBA program, the tuition will be 180,000 ringgit. It's payable in installments. First, once you receive an offer, you will have a commitment fee of 10,000 ringgit to save your seat. Thereafter, prior to every semester, 1/3 or 1/4 of the total fees, depending on which program you're in, will be due. And for those who are joining us on Zoom, living expenses here in Malaysia is highly manageable compared to many other education destinations in the world. Right? This is just a guesstimate that and a close estimate of what we have in terms of rent and in terms of cost. Okay, I'm just going to pause here for questions. Please go ahead. Please identify yourself as well.
Hi, I'm Himmat. What about any scholarship programs or assistance that you might offer to prospective students?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a very good question, a very pertinent question as well. So we do have 2 scholarships for Malaysian students for the full-time MBA program. This is made possible by the generosity of Public Bank Berhad as well as YTL Foundation. So in each year, we have 1 scholarship available each to be given out to a Malaysian student. That's good news. Bad news. We usually try to prioritize the eligibility for those who have applied early in our cycle. Yeah. So if you have not submitted your application, you are kind of late to the punch. But that said, apart from scholarship opportunities, we do have fellowship opportunities to applicants, right? So fellowship for the full-time program can go up to 50% of tuition. For the part-time executive MBA program, it goes up to 15%. So it's like, why the differentiated treatment? Largely because if you're a full-time student, you don't have a source of income. We want to support you as much as we can. But if you're working full-time, we do expect you to co-share that cost of education. So therein, the level of fellowship is not as high. I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Any further questions? Nobody's asking what's being served for lunch? Okay. Gentlemen at the back, you look like you have a question to go. No? Okay. Right, I mean, if you don't have any question at this juncture, we are still going to be around, right? Myself, my colleague Raf, as well as Jaya, who's outside. We will host you for lunch. For those of you who are here in person, we will continue the conversation. So after lunch, there will be the campus tour, right? So if depending, it's free and easy. You are not compelled to ask permission to leave, right? And also for those who want to talk more about the Executive MBA program, do use the QR code to connect with the Director of Executive MBA Program, Juliana Roth, or Jules as we call her. She would love to join us today. Unfortunately, she's currently recruiting in India. So if you'd like to talk more about the Executive MBA program, do get in touch with her if you have not already done so. Okay. And very importantly, your feedback. Please let us know, right? How else can we improve? Please let us know what you enjoyed about the session. We'll look forward to your feedback. If you don't submit a feedback, you don't get to go to lunch. Right, with that, I'll end the session this morning. Thank you all once again for joining us. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, wherever you are, thank you very much. Do send in your feedback. And for those who are here in person, please let us do a bit of Malaysian hospitality. Let us host you to lunch. Thank you all.